Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the fanfic reread project. In this episode, we are continuing our reread of The Dark Knight Rises with a John chapter. However, as a reminder, we are now moving into the unedited chapters. So, to save time for me, I'm going to advise you now to please go and listen to the last episode if you didn't. It is a special episode where we basically played catch up with the fourth POV character that was missing from the edited chapters, Barsad. Knowing what happens in his chapters is important because number one, he comes back in the unedited chapters because it was before he had been written out. And number two, his last chapter in particular kind of leads into the chapter that we're reading now. So to avoid having to go over that again, I'm gonna just politely ask you to please go listen to that episode. So having said that, let's jump right in to this John chapter. John couldn't help but be nervous. Even though this plan was the culmination of months of planning, if even the smallest thing went wrong, they could all end up dead, or maybe even worse. She didn't seem like the only one either. Everybody else there was kind of jumpy too. It would be worth the risk, though, if it went as planned. Three guys walked through the door into the storeroom. "You got any ID?" Foley said to one of them. "Of course not," he said. "Then how can we trust you?" "We've got no choice." Gordon emerged from the back room. "Commissioner Gordon," he said, stepping forward, he being the guy that Foley spoke to. "Captain Jones, Special Forces. Glad to have you here." "How many of you are there?" Jones asked. "Dozens. I'd rather not say exactly. But the men trapped underground number almost 3,000, Gordon answered. "What kind of shape are they in?" "They've been getting food and water." "Can we break them out?" "Yes, sir," John said. Okay, so let's pause here. This chapter is very heavy on dialogue and very light on actual establishment of what the fuck's going on. And what establishment there isn't super good. John says everybody else, quote unquote, there seems like they're jumpy, but reading this, I don't get the distinct feeling that there are any other people in this scene besides John, Captain Jones, Commissioner Gordon, and Foley. She even mentions that two other guys came in with him, but I think of the two guys, one of them has a piece of dialogue, and that's kind of it. They basically don't exist. And it is hard to establish characters like this who are side characters who come in very late in the story, but I feel like there could have been more done to make this more robust. Anyway. If we take out the mercenaries guarding the outflow south of Ackerman Park and blow the rubble, we'll have a hole big enough for 10 at a time. We've been in contact with the officers down there. They're just waiting for the day. "Men who haven't seen daylight in 5 months," the man behind him said. "Police officers who haven't seen daylight in 5 months," she reminded them. If those guys had literally just introduced themselves so they had names instead of just being the man. "Oh, what about the bomb?" Jones said. "The satellites can't see any radiation hotspots." "They keep it on a truck," Gordon told him. "It must have a lead-lined roof. They move it constantly." "You know the truck?" "They've got 3 of them. The routes don't vary much." "What about the triggerman?" "It's a bluff," she told him. "Bane wouldn't give that trigger to just anybody. If he doesn't have it himself, one of his men does. We still can't take any chances. Until we have the triggerman for sure, we'll just track the device, smuggle men over." She cut him off. "Meanwhile, Gotham lives under a warlord like some failed state." If John was going to cut off the character, why not just have her actually cut him off? Have the dialogue be with a dash and then go straight into her dialogue instead of saying she cut him off. This was a problem that popped up in Batman Begins a lot too. "Dial it back, officer. The situation is unprecedented," Jones said to her. "We can't do anything to risk millions of lives." She looked at Gordon and Foley. "Aren't you going to tell him?" Gordon looked down. "The situation is more complicated than you think. There's someone you need to meet." John led Jones and his men down the streets. She pulled her bangs out of the clip that had been holding them back and let them cover her face. She didn't know who might recognize her out here. "I'll be honest, sir," she said quietly. "You weren't the captain we were expecting." "Honestly, neither was I." She looked at him. "General Rogers is currently detained." "Doing what?" "It's classified. I don't know." It's nice of this story to pay lip service to the fact that Steve's not here. And it's not just them being like, "Oh, Steve's doing something classified." The thing about this story is that it exists outside of the context it was supposed to exist in, because I eventually kicked it out of continuity and then abandoned this version of the universe entirely. Steve actually did have a story happening at the time, and he was missing in action, I think, but people weren't saying that because he's fucking Captain America. It's something like that. Though I will say Steve being a general is something that did stick into the Earth 1 versions of Captain America and stuff. But anyway, it is nice of the story to mention, like, why he's not there. Because in a shared universe like this, you would have the question. So it is nice that for the first time ever, the story actually confronts the question like that. Because it sure doesn't do it for Tony. But anyway. She led them to an empty bank building in Midtown, a nice place all done up in white marble. I was up here looking for a vantage point, she said on the elevator. I found the people who run the corporation that owns it living up here. What corporation? Jones asked her. Wayne Enterprises. They stepped out into the offices on a floor with a balcony that overlooked more offices below. She led them right to Mr. Fox and Miss Tate. And Mr. Fox, if you could brief the captain, please. Okay, so this is something that confuses me. So as they're going into the building, we come right off of the conversation about Steve. And then suddenly John is like, I was up here looking for a vantage point, and I found the people who run the corporation that owns it living up here. Are they talking about the bank, or are they talking about the bomb? That's really confusing. So did they suddenly like switch things, or is she just describing like what the place is? Like I don't even know. If it's the latter, at the very least, I can say that that does make sense. But moving on. Mr. Fox, if you could brief the captain, please. Miss Tate is fully aware of the situation, Fox said. Not going to introduce them at all? No. And as CEO of Wayne Enterprises, she continued, I have to take responsibility for it. Why? Jones said. Because we built it. You built the bomb? It was built as a fusion reactor, the first of its kind, said Fox. Bain turned the core into a bomb and removed it from the reactor. As the device's fuel cells decay, it becomes increasingly unstable until the point of detonation. The bomb is a time bomb, Jones said, shocked, and it will go off, and soon. Could you disarm it? Jones said to Fox. I could reconnect it to the reactor and stabilize it. We have to let the Pentagon know. We'll move away from this location and call it in. Officer Blake, he said, turning to her, you stay here and look after these people. Jones and his men turned for the elevator. Only a few minutes later, gunshots rang out from over the railing. Damn it, somebody sold us out. Take Miranda, Fox began. John pulled out her gun. We're not leaving you here, Fox. She grabbed him by the arm. Miranda was already ahead of them, pulling along the hand... What? Pulling along the hand of a girl she didn't recognize. That's a weird way to say that. Pulling a girl she didn't recognize by the hand. Even that's kind of unwieldy, but it makes more sense. They ducked into an empty office, and John slammed the door shut behind them. It sounded like a war zone out there, but then it suddenly went quiet. She could hear someone moving outside of the door, a set of suspiciously quiet footsteps. John moved beside it, gun at the ready. Mr. Fox, she heard him say. It was Bain. An involuntary shudder ran through her body. It sounded like he was in the room with them. The girl slapped her hands over her mouth, hyperventilating. If you must know, I disarmed the core, reconnected it, and turned the reactor on. She heard him begin to move away. How else do you think I got the power on? And that is the end of that chapter. That chapter was bad. I think this is the first time I've read any chapter in this and just been like, it's bad. I think my biggest problem with this is that this chapter is really confusing, and the writing itself is very like, this feels like the first draft of this chapter. Like, I never went back and tried to add in anything that could help make the action more dynamic or just make the events of the chapter more dynamic. It just feels like I was trying to get the dialogue on the page with the barest bits of prose to go along with it. It just is not working for me at all. Furthermore, I'm a little confused as to why Bain admitted that he put the bomb back in the machine. I feel like that's a tidbit of information he might want to keep to himself so that they can be all scaled. Because they would have picked up on the fact that he had been bluffing about the bomb when it doesn't go off. That's just strange. It just feels like an excuse to put the information out there without really thinking about like the implications of what this means. So, moving over what is apparently an edited version of the next chapter, it's not finished, and it's like literally like a few lines of dialogue. So we're just gonna skip over it and go to the original version of this chapter, which is another John chapter. She was still heated when she finally got back downtown. She came barreling into Selena's house. Where is he? Who? Barsad? She said. He's in the den. Why? John barched. When you barge past her. John marched past her and through the door. He was right there, like she said, his electric blue eyes darting down the page of some book. Why couldn't she just say he was on the couch instead of like, oh, there he is, just like she said? It just makes it seem redundant. He looked up when she entered the room. Oh, what's wrong? What's wrong? She echoed. What's wrong is that somehow Bane knew what we were doing, and now 3 special forces operatives are dead. Care to explain? By then, Selena was in the doorway next to her, looking just as angry as John felt. Barsad's eyes widened. I didn't tell him anything. I haven't been up there since I left. I haven't seen him. It could have been someone else, Jen said. He's got people everywhere. Where did she come from? There's no other way he could have known. It was too perfect. There are other ways, Jen said. John turned to her. Like what? John looked at Jen, who looked at Barsad, who just looked back at her. Are you going to tell her? She said. John and Selena both looked at her then. I'll tell you if he won't. No, I'll do it. He closed the book and put it on the side table. You might want to sit. Why? I don't know. It might shock you, or it might just be a long story. Either way. She sat in the old chair in the corner. Selena perched on the armrest, while Jen pushed his blankets out of the way and sat next to him on the couch. The cat came and jumped into his lap. He took a deep breath. Jen kicked him. Come on. I am. It's not the kind of thing you just go around telling people. You told me. That was different, he said, rubbing his leg. John looked at him expectantly. He sighed again. He has seers. Excuse me, John said. Seers, like clairvoyance. You're kidding, right? Selena said, but John was speechless. She shouldn't have believed him. It couldn't be true, and yet it still made sense to her. She thought of Mark, and the little girl with the pigtails, and the kids she had seen when she lived at the home. Gordon's voice echoed in her head. He was right again. In an old version of the story, there was a little girl with pigtails, I think, who predicted that the lights were going to turn on. Meanwhile, I think Mark still was the one that pointed out to John that Rose was there. I decided to nix the little girl because we had already established that Mark seemed to be clairvoyant, so having him tell John about the lights and about Rose made sense. There was no point in adding another random kid. But it is funny that John's like, oh yeah, and there were more kids that I saw when I lived at the home. I think that was something she had thought about in one of her previous chapters, but it was edited out of the new version. It honestly makes Saint Swithin sound like the Gotham version of like the X-Men or something like that, but it's not. Moving on. He has quite a few. One of them must have seen something. Selena was shaking her head in disbelief. Jen looked at him. Wait, you told me that he could see the Batman. John looked up at the mention of the name. What is... Oh, God. I can't read. What's this about the Batman? He said Bane said he was dead. She felt her heart sink a little. She'd pretty much determined it herself, but it seemed so much more final to hear it this way. Jen continued on. But you said he could see him before. I know, but I didn't mean it like that. Bane doesn't see, he feels people. He could always tell when I was angry or upset, like that. He reads emotions mostly, but he can feel their life too. He was straining to feel the Batman anyway, since he was on the island. Island? John asked. In the asylum. He can't look too far. It's impossible that he had felt you, Joanna, unless he was standing right next to you, which I doubt would have gone unnoticed. There are so many people that he'd have to have complete focus on just you or Gordon or whoever else was with you. It's not what he's best at. Selena looked at him, skeptical. What is he best at? He projects. He can make his voice fill rooms or make people hear it in their heads. The look on Selena's face changed immediately, like she'd had an epiphany about something horrible. He can make people see things too, but he doesn't do that often. He hardly goes that far. What about you? John asked. Can you do anything? Nothing. After a moment, he added, I was sick when I was a baby. That's why my eyes look like this. He must have noticed the way she was looking at him. What kind of disease changes your eye color to something like that? Fantastic illnesses have fantastic symptoms, he answered. Is that why his eyes are like that? Selena asked. Oh, God, okay. Veins? She nodded. Something like that, yes. That's why his eyes are black. Barsad said that in case it got confusing. But I mean, when you look in his eyes, they're... She didn't seem to be able to finish her sentence. John noted the look of discomfort on her face. Oh, that. I don't know how he does that. I know he has control over it, though. In honesty, he doesn't really understand it either. The revelation that all these things were not only real, but also weapons being wielded by their enemy was a lot to take in. His people might be able to see whatever they tried to do next. The thought was extremely frustrating. Take me back a minute, Jen said, breaking the silence that had formed. Fantastic diseases? What about them? Barsad said. Fantastic, quote unquote, implied. Like non-human. John leaned forward. Bane's not human? You're not human? Selena asked him. He's a vampire. We both are. John's eyes widened. You might have told us that before. You didn't ask. John just looked at him. Besides, of all the things that I've told you about him, that should be the least worrying. Yeah, but we gotta take precautions for this kind of thing. What kind of precautions would you take for this kind of thing? You have guns. That's all you need. But I've seen him, Selena said. He could pick up the Batman by the neck with one hand. I won't pretend that the bite hasn't enhanced his strength and amplified his abilities. He looked down. But Bane's not but he's not bulletproof. No vampire could run through Gotham's entire police force by themselves. Well, Bane isn't just any vampire, but the point still stands. Jesus, John said, bringing her hands to her face. We have to tell Gordon about this. He's not going to believe us, Selena said. Neither of them will, unless we have proof, which we don't. John sighed. We can try. They ought to know what we're up against, at least. And that is the end of that chapter. Oh, God. Oh, God. That chapter feels so long. I don't even know if it actually is that long, but it definitely feels really long. I will say this chapter is better quality-wise than last chapter, but enjoyment-wise, I didn't like this one as much either. This one does have some jokey jokes in it, so I'll give it that, but that's about it. I know the last time I read this is the chapter that really cinched for me the fact that the tone of this part of the story is completely different than the tone of the edited chapters. In particular, the fact that there are like jokes and stuff, it's not a lighthearted feeling, but there is a slightly lighter feeling. In particular, the John's line that's like, we got to take precautions. What kind of precautions can we take? That in particular feels like something that you would not find in like a more serious work. Yeah, I don't really have that much to say. Oh, well, this chapter is actually really important. We actually do need to talk about this more. Because the function of this chapter in the old version of the story is that it is the big reveal. Because up until this point in all of the stories, The Dark Knight Rises and The Dark Knight and Batman Begins, there haven't been any outright mentions of magic at all. The closest thing we came to even the implication that magic was real was in Batman Begins, when Batman's inner monologue would be like, oh my god, I can't believe Ra's al Ghul just spoke my feelings like that. How does he always know? That kind of stuff, that barely counts. Like, and then there were a few like little mentions and hints here and there throughout Barsad's old chapters in the first part of the story, but it never came out and said like, I am a vampire, this is this, there are clairvoyants. Like, that was never a thing until right now. And this was really important because it wasn't just supposed to be the moment that I call it the veil lifting moment, but it wasn't supposed to lift the veil just on the story, but it was supposed to lift the veil on the entire world. I had always meant for this story, or this series, to be the first thing that a person read when coming into the quote-unquote mainstream universe. I think I did explain this before, but way back in the day, the designations of like Earth 1 and Earth 2 didn't exist. So instead of there being like the low magic Earth 1 and the higher magic Earth 2, everything was part of what was called the mainstream universe. So essentially what that meant is that stories like Pirates of the Caribbean and Harry Potter, and then stuff like this and Captain America and all the superhero stuff, all took place on the same planet. The way I wanted it to go, not that I could control the way people did it, but the way I wanted it to go is that I wanted people to read these three stories so you could get the feeling like Batman Begins is supposed to be like completely mundane, and then The Dark Knight is just like that bridge. But then you get to this story and things start to change a little bit until this moment, and then it's the giant reveal. And then from here you would go on and read much more magical stuff like your Harry Potters and your Thors and your Pirates of the Caribbean, that kind of thing. Like, this chapter is very important. It does not change the fact that this chapter is also very, very flawed. Because number one, cramming all of this into one chapter and making it this huge reveal means that this chapter is 99.9% exposition. And I do think I tried to avoid info dumping by giving this chapter a conversational format, but that just makes the chapter feel even longer, because it gives the feeling that they're having like a meandering conversation, because a character will be like, what's this mean? And the character will be like, oh, this, and then another character will be like, but what's this? I definitely think there could have been a much more straightforward way, and even like preserving the sort of conversational format, but there had to be a much more straightforward way to do this instead of constantly hopping around and little moments where characters are kicking other characters, which is another thing that makes this lighter like feeling to it. Like, I understand the importance of the chapter, but that doesn't make me like it. So, moving on, we are going to Bruce now. The last week had been overwhelming for him. He had been overloaded with information about why all of the strange things kept happening. What? He had been overloaded with information about why all of the strange things kept happening to him. These strange things, not why these strange things. That's strange. As if these strange things are only happening to him. The answers were not the ones he had been hoping for, or the ones he had been expecting, or the ones he thought existed. Pamela and Belinda traded theories over his bed while he and Dr. Ryan stared at them bewildered and slightly lost, respectively. So, worth noting that in this version of the story, instead of Brianna being a nurse at Arkham Asylum to bring back this character, instead we had a character named Pamela who was based. She was inspired by poison. She was a reference to Poison Ivy, I'll say, because she wasn't Poison Ivy. You'll see why as we get into his chapters. Besides the fact that Poison Ivy is a botanist and she would not be working at Arkham Asylum. As well, Warden Sharp's name changed between it. I don't know why that happened, but I think I genuinely do not know what happened there, like why she went from being Belinda to being Letitia, but it happened. So Letitia is Belinda, and instead of Brianna or Brie, we have Pamela. He still couldn't wrap his mind around the idea that he wasn't human anymore. In theory, it made sense. He had healed far too quickly. He could see perfectly in pitch black darkness, and he'd sprouted fangs, which had somehow gone unnoticed by him before, among other things. But those things couldn't be real. Magic couldn't be real. There was supposed to be a rational explanation for what was happening to him, but there wasn't. They couldn't seem to figure out what he was any more than he could. They figured he might be a lycanthrope of some type, maybe. He didn't understand at first. If he was a werewolf or what have you, why hadn't he turned into a wolf during the full moons? Belinda told him that she and Pamela were lycanthropes too, but that they didn't transform because they were both half human. That seems unnecessary. Why does it have to be both of them? Why not just one? Also, the fact that seemingly Dr. Ryan is not in any of this, she's just like a human. But, like, it makes sense to me that Letitia Sharp, given circumstances, would either not be human or have something else going on with her that makes her not a normal human. Fine. I don't see why Pamela had to be. Like, I don't know. That was a little bit weird. Why not make her a plant person as a reference to Poison Ivy? No, but, they told him that, in his case, the massive trauma from getting his back broken could have stunted the transformation, and that would explain why it seemed so partial and why he had trouble getting a grip on himself when he did. He didn't know his own strength, and more than a few helpless chairs had fallen victim to his heavy hands. Why it seems so... Oh, the transformation. Okay, that was confusing a little bit. I think my brain just forgot what I was reading, like, before I stopped reading it. After that, a whole new question came to light. How had he gotten this way? He had thought Bane did it to him at first. They had told him that the bite could be given by needle, as a way to try to bribe him into switching sides. That true justice line hadn't left his mind since he woke up. Belinda doubted that, though. She asked him to describe what happened to him after they gave him the needle, and from what he said, apparently, he was describing an anesthetic. He asked what kind of anesthetic put people in a coma for 2 months. She told him it was very, very heavy. So, just as a note, because this is not something that's ever actually described in this, but the implication that was supposed to be in this story, and it's something that would have only came through Barsad's chapters as well, but again, I didn't do it super well, is that the anesthetic that Bane gave Bruce is the same anesthetic that he uses to not feel the pain in his back. For those of you who haven't seen the movie, Bane has a massive spinal injury, which is the reason why in the hyper-realistic Christopher Nolan universe he wears that mask instead of it being for the reason from the comics. So there was supposed to be a connection there, and it's like, oh, okay, I get it. And then that in turn would have explained those scenes in Barsad's chapters when Bane isn't wearing a mask. Bruce was still human, I think, when this was going on. Bruce got knocked the fuck out. Presumably it's more anyway than the dosage that Bane takes, but Bane would be able to take a needle of that stuff and then not have to wear his mask for like some hours or something like that, you know, just to give him a fucking break. And this was supposed to come together, but again, didn't do a super good job of seeding that, so now I have to tell you about it. She asked him to try to think back before that, if anything had happened then. He couldn't think of anything at first, but then he remembered the day after he'd gone to see Fox, how he'd overslept 6 hours. He told her about that, also mentioning his knee and how quickly the pain had dulled. He immediately mentioned the medicine as well. It didn't make sense, though. He didn't understand why Fox would do that, and without his permission as well, though it wasn't like he would have given it anyway. That was pretty far to go just to heal a messy knee. That was completely out of character for him, and to his surprise, Belinda agreed. She knew him as well. It was the only other explanation, though, and it made sense in context. His transformation had been slowed down by his back then. That was one mystery down, he thought. It was the only one they seemed to be able to solve at the moment. Yeah, that does make sense. But here's the thing about this. I kind of harped on this a lot way back in the fanfic live tweets, in particular the Redux, and I do still agree, though, that I think I should have made it so that Bane was the one that gave him the quote-unquote bite. I guess that's what we're calling it. Because the circumstances that lead to him getting it from Fox are so contrived. It's already kind of a mess anyway for Fox to give him medicine. I mentioned way back in the chapter that he actually is talking about here that I think it's illegal. I don't think you can do that. You can't just give someone pain medicine and when you're not a doctor. And as far as we know, Lucius Fox is not a doctor of any type. But then to not only do that, which is already kind of a mess, and then make it so that Fox accidentally gave him something that was not the thing that it's just too contrived. If Bane had done it, that makes total sense, because number one, yeah, Bane's not a dot, but Bane's like, he's already a criminal, he's gonna do stuff, like, we're not expecting him to be like moral, and also not make simple mistakes like giving people werewolf serum instead of fucking pain medicine. Number two, what Bruce posits here about Bane doing it as a way to bribe him into switching sides kind of makes sense, but it actually would make more sense for him to do it just to fix Bruce's back. But then you get to the part where it's like, and then bribe him into switching sides, and that kind of does make sense, you know? Like, it's a shame when the wrong answer makes more sense than the right answer, you know what I mean? But anyway, this chapter is long, so we need to get back to reading. As the days passed, he realized he might have been going a little stir-crazy. He spent most of the time he wasn't building his body, pacing up and down the hallways. He started sleeping a lot more, mostly just to pass the time. God. Once he had went all the way into the basement, flipped the Joker on his back, and then left. He didn't seem to mind, though. He just laughed. So we need to talk about the Joker. And we already established in the edited chapters that the Joker and Jonathan Crane are in Arkham Asylum. As I mentioned back in that episode, Victor Zsasz and Killer Croc are not here. Zsasz is still on the island, and Killer Croc I don't think exists in this version. Or if he does, he just hasn't been mentioned yet. I don't know why he was in it anyway, but anyway, so it is important to note because there are some Bruce chapters missing. Apparently, the Joker and Jonathan Crane just kind of set up camp down in the basement of the mansion, and they're just kind of chilling down there. They do not come upstairs all that often. But in the old version of the story, Bruce went downstairs for the first time when he was exploring the mansion. As his back healed more and more, he would be able to travel further and further. Well, originally, that chapter ended with him being able to finally get down to the basement. And immediately he walks in there and it looks like Creepy Land because apparently the Joker got bored and decided to just scribble all over the walls. I don't know why. But he goes down there, he actually speaks to them, and the Joker is the one that points out that his eyes are the wrong color. Because what happens is actually, and this is actually kind of interesting, is that Bruce comes to the door. It's very dark, so they can't exactly see each other. But like Joker and Scarecrow are all the way on the other side of the room. And the Joker refers to Bruce as Batman. And Bruce is like, what the fuck? What the fuck? What do you mean? And he's like, yeah, you can't trick me, what with your eyes and such. I don't remember exactly how he says it. But he's like, yeah, I'd know those eyes anywhere or something like that. And Bruce is like, what? And then that's like where the chapter ends. And it's like, oh shit, his eyes are yellow. And I think that was actually pretty fun, and I kind of wish I hadn't taken it out, because then we were introduced to these two characters a little bit earlier, and then this chapter would have made more sense. But I think I was supposed to insert a whole other Bruce chapter to sort of bridge the gap between that and what was happening here. Something like that. So let's get back to reading this. The strange happenings around the mansion seemed to increase as time went on as well. He discovered that the mansion had a second basement with a stairwell that continued down to it from the same one that led to the first basement. That's confusing. He had wondered how he had missed it before and thought it was nothing special, until he realized that the reason he missed it is because the stairwell hadn't been there before. He went down there a second time and was met by a solid wall. At first he thought he was going crazy. How could a whole floor just disappear in the thin air? But Pamela assured him that he wasn't. Things like that happened all the time. She told him there were a few other rooms that did the same thing, like one on the second floor that sometimes opened to the old master bedroom and other times just opened to the wall. Mansion's weird like that sometimes, she had told him. He was inclined to agree, but he still found it wholly disconcerting. I would as well. Wholly disconcerting. There was also the day he decided to climb up on top of the canopy in the lobby. He'd spent some time examining the elaborate designs painted on its underside and the columns and the ones pressed into the floor beneath it. They seemed familiar to him somehow, like he'd seen something like it before. That's usually what that means. If it was deja vu, I would have said that, right? It wasn't so tall that he couldn't reach the top of the column from the ground. He stretched up and grabbed at the ledge. He dug his claws into the thick wood as he pulled himself. Okay. Once he sat himself on the dome top, he looked down at the ledge to see how much damage he'd done. There wasn't even a mark. It didn't make any sense. He distinctly remembered pressing his claws into the wood. He put his hands to the surface beneath him and pressed his nails into it. He felt the sensation again, like they were going into the surface, but when he looked at them, the tips hadn't even pushed into it. He slid down the back side of the dome to the window. He did the same again, putting his nails to the glass. He felt the sensation of them being pushed through, as if the glass were made of some type of soft plastic. They hadn't even cracked the pane. He looked down at his hands. How could he do that? It was impossible, but it had happened. He felt a strange feeling start to well up in his stomach, something like what he'd felt when he ventured down to the basement the first time. He didn't want to get himself all worked up over that. Besides, he was stuck with it, and it'd definitely come in handy. He moved back to the top of the dome and turned his eyes to its surface, the thing he'd come up there for. That's kind of a weird thing. Like, sure, it's another magic thing, but why? Why can't he just climb? I don't understand. The only reason I'm even commenting on it is because I devoted like 3 paragraphs to him figuring this out, and it's such a like strange thing to put in there that I'm wondering like what exactly was the point? Like, I'm not entirely sure I understand why he has this specific power. I'm wondering if it had something to do with him climbing up buildings, but you don't need to have weird sticking powers to go up the building, just be able to climb. When he looked down at them, he realized it was because he'd seen them before. It was the same one that had been pressed into the altar in basement. What? The way this is written is so confused. When he looked down at them, he realized it was because he'd seen them before. It was the same one that had been pressed into the altar in the basement of the monastery. He was surprised he even remembered it, but its beauty was so striking. It was only then that he realized that the gaps in its tangled masses formed a cross. He looked up. There was one painted in the center of the ceiling as well, among a roiling mass of other twisting shapes. What? I'm confused about that. Number one, he's talking about the symbols on the top of the, like, when he looked down at the symbols, how hard would it have been to say when he looked down at the symbols? You can't just spend 3 paragraphs talking about something completely different and then act like we're picking up right where we left off. Like, very confusing. Moving on though. For some reason, Ra's al Ghul's voice echoed in his head. Is Ra's al Ghul immortal? Are his methods supernatural? He remembered the vivid color of his eyes and the way it seemed as if they glowed when the light was low. Was he immortal? Or his methods supernatural? He couldn't be sure. He knew nothing of this new world outside of what he'd been told. I was a comedy genius when I was 20, wasn't I? Jesus. Again, lines like that are what make it feel like the tone of this story has changed quite a bit between versions. Or his method supernatural. That night at dinner, he did manage to ask whether someone could even be immortal. Dr. Ryan shook her head, but then backtracked. Well, there is one person. It's strange because General Rogers isn't like you all. He's human. Bruce tilted his head. A human? That's what they say. She paused to bite her food. But everything I've ever heard about him seems like urban legends, you know? I heard he got shot through his throat and all it did was change his voice, Pamela said. Dr. Ryan pointed at her with her fork. See? Well, Belinda began, as long as it's been, they almost are. How long has it been? Since what Pamela mentioned? 20 years, maybe more. But he's been around a lot longer than that. Stories like that are just the tip of the iceberg. Why do you ask? Dr. Ryan said. All right, we need to talk about this. And I did mention this before. I think in like episode 3 or something like that, or 4. But in mainstream universe, unlike Earth 1, Steve was not Tony's goddad. However, that makes no fucking sense. Because essentially what happened, and this is spoilers for Captain America, my Captain America fic, if Steve Rogers lives past the events of Captain America, or just is existent and around and like there is no reason why Tony Stark would not know him. And by extension, if Bruce Wayne is best friends with Tony Stark, there is no reason why Bruce would not know this. He should know all about this shit. And for some reason, it did not dawn on me until well after this, and I was like into writing Captain America in the fall. So later the year that I kicked this story out of continuity, I realized like, oh wait, wouldn't Steve know Tony? Wouldn't Steve be in Tony's life? I don't know why that didn't occur to me, that like him and Howard Stark were actually pretty fucking tight. Like, I don't know. It's just really weird to watch them tell Tony Stark's best friend Bruce Wayne these things about the man that should be like Tony Stark's basically, if not his other dad, just like his uncle. Like, come on. It's very, very weird. But, yeah. Anyway, he hesitated. He doubted it would matter if he told them about Roz. It wasn't like he had anything to lose, but he was still careful with his words. He couldn't help it. There was someone I met a while ago. He asked me if I thought he was immortal. Back then I thought he was human, but now I don't know. Do you know how old he was? Like, for real? Pamela asked. Bruce shook his head. He didn't look a day over 50, though. A lot of us don't, Belinda said. But in any event, I can assure you that he's not immortal. None of us are. The oldest vampires in the world are thousands of years old, and even they can be killed at any time. Most of us won't even make it past 300, if that. Why? Well, Pamela began, if you can make it to about 200 or 300 without killing yourself, getting killed by someone else, or getting a life-threatening disease, you'll get hit with one of a ton of even more horrible diseases that'll kill you. Some people do make it past that, but it's rare. You all don't seem too worried about it. Nah, we're hardwired that way, she said, tapping her temple. It's not like we can avoid it. Someone told me once that being a werewolf means accepting the fact that you'll die screaming. He laughed. His training with Roz had not gone to waste in more aspect than one. The absence of a fear of death would come in handy for him then, in a couple of centuries or so anyway. How cute. I feel like that die screaming line was inspired by that line that Daenerys has. I don't know if it's in the book, but it definitely is in the show. Yeah, I don't have a lot to say about that. Though I will say that the whole, like, you'll get, like, a terrible disease and die at this age, that descends from a story that existed long before I decided to write this. Like, I made that story up back when I was in high school, which was at the latest 2010. So 3 years before that. Mind you, there was a time in my life where I actually stopped writing completely for reasons that I won't get into here. And that happened in, I think, 2010 or 2011. So that is like old, especially compared to like now, 2019. But it is interesting to see something from a story from before I even started writing make it into something that I was writing. But moving on. In the middle of all that, he was still dealing with his identity crisis. He didn't know if he would call it a crisis now, though. While the answer still eluded him, he felt much closer to it than he had the last time he thought about it. He was positive of what he wasn't, but he couldn't quite grasp what he was. The last 4 years had been miserable for him, but the night of the stock market, he realized that it had nothing to do with Rachel's death and everything to do with the Batman. He didn't know if he could live without it again, and he didn't think he wanted to. Alfred didn't seem to understand in that aspect why he needed the suit so badly. If he was honest, he wasn't so sure he understood himself, but when he got out of here, he knew better than to deny himself that again. Rachel was righter than she knew. Oh, that's a line that you'll see. X was righter than they knew, repeated throughout this. I think there are at least 2 more after this, but there might be more. In the end, they couldn't figure out what he was. His claws were all wrong. He had too many fangs. The list went on and on. The one thing they could agree on was that he wasn't human anymore. It was funny. He was as big a mystery to others as he was to himself. They still discussed it even after they said they had given up, however. What kind of therianthrope has hands like this? Belinda said, examining the dark claws that tipped his fingers. Never seen anything like it before in my life. Really? Is it that weird? Like, I understand, like, there's the length of the claw, but it's like, it's not that. What? Before I went out, after they gave me the needle, I felt Bane press into my jaw, he said, pointing to an area below his bottom lip. Why did he do that? He asked her. She looked up. I thought you said you couldn't feel anything. I couldn't feel his hand, but I felt the pressure. He was feeling for your fangs, but I don't know why he would. You didn't. She was cut off by Bruce shushing her. He closed his eyes, listening hard to a faint sound above the ceiling. He'd heard it many, many times before. What is it? She asked quietly. He opened his eyes and looked up. The sound of flapping wings was unmistakable. Bats, he said. Of course it was, he thought. How had he forgotten? And that's the end of that chapter. That is the last chapter we're going to read for this episode. The next chapter after this is also very long, and this episode will be 7 years if I try to do that. So, I will say this. This chapter is better than the last two we read. I liked it better. I still didn't like it that much though, but I definitely felt more engaged with this chapter than I did the other ones that we've read. So there is that. A lot of Bruce's chapters at this point in the story tend to be playing catch up with him, while the other characters kind of live in the moment, where they'll have chapters that take place at like moments during a certain day, or they'll cover it like 2 days at the most. Bruce's chapters tend to cover between like a few weeks to a month at a time because he is so separated from everyone else. He can't have as many chapters, while the other characters can spread out chapters between each other. So that's why this chapter is not only super long, but it is like 99.9% prose. The writing is really not doing it for me. I definitely can tell that we're reading something older than what we'd been reading before, but this chapter compared to the others was not that bad. It definitely was readable. It's just a lot of words and it's really long, but for what it is, this chapter is very important, and I think it gets across all of the shit that it needs to get across in the amount of time that it has, which was a lot of time, but still. Lots of interesting little character things, a lot of new information. One thing I do respect past me for is the arrangement of the chapters here. And having this chapter come right off of the heels of the other characters finding out that magic and magical people are real really puts this chapter in context. And this chapter really expands on that by telling you even more about it. So I like that. I think that that works very well. I just wish it was written better. I also like that Bruce's transformation, it's not just moving in sync with what's happening with the other characters, but it's also his character arc is progressing at the same time that this new thing is happening to him. The story actually lampshades it at that one point where he's like, he knew what he wasn't, though he couldn't figure out what he was. And like at the same time, the characters can't figure out what the hell is going on with him. I think that's actually pretty clever and works pretty well. Like, this story had some actual good ideas, but the execution of the ideas was flawed because it's pretty old and was like my first attempt at actually trying to do shit like this. So like I said, I can respect what I was trying to do here, even though I recognize that it is not as good as it could have been. For the time, it's pretty impressive. But yeah, so overall, yeah, I think this is the point where the overall chapter feelings might have to go away now, because I don't want to start repeating myself. I did not like these as much as I liked the previous stuff. But however, I knew that this was going to happen because I've read this before and I had the same exact feeling. I went from enjoying the edited parts of the story despite its flaws to getting to this part and just being like, oh no, you know? But I'm trying to look at it from the point of view of this is what I was trying to do back then and just trying to respect what I was doing while also still recognizing its flaws. So, it's still very, because that first John chapter, even for the time, was just not acceptable. But the other two, definitely were a step up, and it feels like things might get a little better, but we'll see going forward. So, next episode, we start with a Selena chapter, a very, very long Selena chapter, but we're picking up where the last John chapter left off. So, if you like this video, like it on the YouTubes, and then subscribe. You can catch up on this series and watch some of the other fanfic reread project videos or whatever other videos I might have on my YouTube whenever I decide to upload this. And I will see you next episode. Bye.